America's influence reaches across the globe. Whether you find that positive or negative or somewhere in the middle, you have to acknowledge the considerable power America wields in foreign affairs. One aspect of that power is the foreign aid America distributes to other countries. Does that aid come with a price? What should America expect from the countries that receive it? We examine the price of foreign aid today on a special Economist versus Economist episode of The Professors.
From across the city and the 7 city colleges of Chicago, broadcasting from 63rd and Halsted at Kennedy King College. Professors take the art of conversation to a higher degree.
I'm Rashid Carter from Olive Harvey College, and joining me today is professor and fellow economist Antonio Vasquez from Wright College. So Antonio, first of all, I think it's proper to start with a discussion of what is foreign aid.
Well, foreign aid plays many roles. In terms of the U.S., we spend a lot on peace and security and health. Those are the 2 biggest areas. And most of the peace and security goes into stabilizing the country internally and externally from any threats that are out there. After that is economic aid, humanitarian aid, and then using the money for democracy and human rights. But those are very small. The largest share, the lion's share, goes the $11.7 billion to the people that are working in the security sector of that country internally. And for example, let's take a case like Egypt, which has been in the news recently.
Okay.
Now, one of the questions that people ask is, what motivates us to give foreign aid? Well, it turns out if you look at the nation of Egypt, that they received about $2 billion a year since 1979. And so you think, well, what happened in 1979? The Camp David Accords, which allowed the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. So perhaps we do, in a very maybe covert or implicit sense, yes, don't state it, that we expect something in return. However, overall, the Heritage Foundation did a report recently and said that if we are choosing to do that to advance our national interests by spending on foreign aid, that we end up having a very poor record at the UN with 95% of the people to whom we give money to vote against us when it comes time for an important vote at the UN.
So it doesn't turn into a good long-term investment?
No, it doesn't seem to. And what they're saying is that perhaps we should make explicit. That is, I should say, you scratch my back, I scratch your back, you scratch my back. That is, you want to make sure that there is some implicit, now more explicit agreement that I expect certain outcomes when it comes time to advance my nation's interests.
So how does the foreign aid allocation process happen now? Is it that countries are given money and there are not many conditions or expectations attached to that giving versus a model that you're now putting forth which says that, okay, we'll attach our monetary giving to your producing results that demonstrate that you deserve that money?
Right now, quite often, it's to provide education and support and put in the infrastructure, whether it's investment in human capital, that is training the personnel so that they can replicate the institutions that we have here, or to create institutions within their own nation using the people they have domestically. And then some of it is infrastructure to go in and provide loans and guarantees to go in and improve education, build a school, build a medical clinic. And so in those areas, we do make physical investments in those countries.
So it seems like that it's really about an extension of American values and ideologies. We want to create mini Americas in other countries. Does that seem to be what's going on?
It can be. The idea, of course, is that we want to further democracy and we want to further capitalism, and that goes with the ideas of the neoliberal model, that we want to have a free market. We like to be able to feel that we can have liberal trade policies so we can all benefit from the training and you and I have, that we're all interdependent. We're depend on each other for things. This case and situation in Japan, we depend on them for memory chips. We depend on them for parts for our cars, for our electronics, and that sense of interdependence is very valuable. And as you learn that other nations can provide benefits to you, you have to provide benefits to them.
Very good. No, I'm sorry. But, you spoke about Japan, and we know that at the present moment, Japan is a very hot button issue as of this airing. How might our foreign aid policy towards Japan change given what's happening right now?
Well, I really don't know a whole lot about the nation of Japan in terms of foreign aid because they are the third largest country in the world. So we don't tend to give a lot of money towards other wealthy countries. We tend to invest in other parts of the third world. For example, I believe it was Richard Nixon's book, The Third War, in which he talked about how the U.S. was going in and supporting countries in Africa to be able to protect South Africa because a number of rare metals that we needed for our military and the special alloys for our weapons came from that nation of South Africa. On the other hand, the Russians knew that, and they went in and provided aids to the countries surrounding South Africa to be able to put pressure. So both the U.S. and Russia used their foreign aid as a way of empire building in a very soft power kind of method.
A bit of economic warfare.
That's correct.
In a certain sense.
Threaten the supply of my enemy, and now I can have a bit of control over them.
Very good. It seems like some of that is happening now. The first thing I think about is Afghanistan, right? We don't hear a lot about it, but we know that they're sitting on a treasure trove of mineral resources of various kinds. And we're all, well, not all of us, but of course the major economic players in the world are trying to vie for position to gain some of the benefits, the monetary benefits that might come out of a nation like Afghanistan. Do you think that sort of investment policy is good for our nation, only investing, looking towards economic aims? I know you mentioned this earlier, but in terms of morality, right, what sort of investment strategy would you advocate moving forward that might be a departure for what we're doing now?
Well, there's a couple of things. When you talk about ethics and morality, I've seen a couple of things on CNN that have been on the religious blog of all places. And a gentleman there asked, what would Jesus cut? I mean, and that was his response to seeing that in some states, I recently saw a different story on CNN, which stated states kick grandma to the curb on all the cuts that they're doing for programs for the elderly, for meals, exercise classes. And so perhaps we needed to put some of those values in our approach. And, you know, as an economist, like myself, we have the one idea from Rawls, the Rawlsian justice, that what we should do is create social programs. It's behind a veil of ignorance in which we don't know our social status. We have no clue where we'll end up in society. And that way, I would possibly create social programs that benefit people that are not well off. And I wouldn't want to tax the rich. If I'm a rich person, I feel I could do that and not go and pay taxes on $250,000 of income or more, as we are in the U.S.
Yes.
But that I really should think of myself as not knowing where I'm going to be at in society, and that is one way to look at it. And of course, they poked holes at his theory, but the idea is that we should be a little bit less concerned about how we are and trying to be empathetic to others. And that's where the United Nations has come out with a set of principles called the Principles for Responsible Investment. And what that talks about is don't think about the short-term horizon. Don't think about this quarter, don't think about next quarter, don't meet goal, don't meet expectations. Is what I'm investing in good for the long term, for the next 40 years, for the next 60 years, for the life of my retirees, for the life of people just starting in my pension fund, for the life of people just beginning? Right. Because if I wear out my planet, in 40 years from now, my investments will be worthless.
Oh, very good.
And so that there's an environmental, there's a social, and a governance issue to those principles.
So it seems like there has to be some comprehensive or holistic strategy behind how we allocate every dollar, whether it be foreign or domestic. And speaking about this dichotomy between foreign and domestic spending, do you think, given our current financial or economic vulnerability here in the United States of America, should we de-emphasize foreign investment or foreign aid, or should we take some of those resources out and reallocate them domestically?
Well, I think we're going to have to. Unfortunately, earlier this year, I'm always looking to pull a story from CNN out to talk about to my class. And I ran across this story, which you can Google it out there, and it says, running the country on 8 cents. And so that basically said that by 2010, if we don't get our deficit under control, according to the Government Accountability Office, so this is not some left-wing group, right. They said that we would have 28% of our budget going to Social Security, another 28% to go to the interest on our debt, so that's 56%. We'd have 21% going to Medicare and 15% to Medicaid.
Wow.
And that would leave 8 cents for everything else.
Wow.
8 cents. And what would we be able to get with that 8 cents? We would be able to get a Department of Labor, or we could have a quarter of the defense spending that we have right now, or, not and, or.
Right.
Or we could have the Department of Labor, Department of Justice, and the Housing and Urban Development, but we'd have to give up the labor, we'd have to give up the defense spending. So perhaps we really do need to rethink foreign aid.
Wow, that's a mind-boggling idea. But the IOUSA website, I usually show this to my students to give them some perspective about how dynamic this problem of deficit spending really is, and how it not only affects us today but in the future. And it really does involve so many different considerations, and it is a complex issue. But it boils down to what you just said. At some point, we're going to have to make some very hard decisions about how we prioritize spending and what sort of public accommodations we feel that we should place at the highest priority, because there's not going to be resources there in the future to facilitate all of those aims. So that's a very important piece, but it seems like in Americana, we're not very much into sacrifice.
No, I mean, and that's really the tough part, because of those 4 programs that I mentioned, they're going to take basically, 2/3 of everything. It is Social Security is an entitlement program. You reach a certain age, you have Medicare, you reach a certain age, you're entitled to that. In Medicaid, a certain level of poverty and physical need, and you're entitled to that. And those are very hot button issues. Right. Like that story from CNN, do we throw grandma to the curb? Right. Do we take away her Medicare and her Social Security?
That's right. Yeah, so that's a hard issue to think about, but I want to reframe that just a little bit differently. So instead of thinking about the tough decision that has to be made, who makes the decision? Ideally, it would be us on the ground level, the people making decisions about how we facilitate our best interests. But ultimately, when it comes to foreign aid, who makes those decisions?
Well, since it is after our national interest, it would have to be ideally through the State Department that can assess what countries are needing our assistance at any particular given time, and also that we have to determine which is our top priority in terms of our own national interest. As you mentioned, Afghanistan and Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, those are all part of our very important needs of the moment. And for example, I guess in Forbes magazine, they talked about some of the top 4 nations in which we're providing foreign aid to. And number 1 on there is Afghanistan, followed by Pakistan, Israel, and Egypt. Right. And so all the hot button areas are specifically where we are spending our money. And it is to further our national interests, which is a very difficult thing to do given the complexities of the relationships in the Middle East, which unfortunately were created by previous empires. Of course. When the British Empire decided it was going to cut apart the Middle East after the fall of World War I and World War II, they created Iraq out of 3 peoples who never got along historically. Right. And now we're still cleaning up the mess that we created after World War I. Well, English created after World War I, since they were the winners.
But we're having to clean up that mess anyway, so it ultimately becomes us. Oil and our energy dependence. How does that play a role here?
Well, when you go to look at those nations, we're hoping that we would be able to provide some assistance to Iraq. We had provided foreign aid to them in terms of military assistance because, of course, talking about that indirectly, we could even use that and subsume it under the guise of peace and security that we would use as foreign aid. You have to remember that the weapons that Saddam Hussein was given came from the United States. Right. He received the anthrax, he received the nerve gas, he received those through the United States in order to further our interest by pursuing a war with Iran, which is our enemy. Right. So that old story, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's right. And so we have used our foreign aid in terms of being the military spending that we go out there, which again is interpreted as securing the nation from internal and external threats. Okay. So under that guise, the military spending we give to those countries, as a matter of fact, in Egypt, that's the biggest spending we do have with them, is to help their military. And of course, it gives you a good deal of control in a way over the military.
Very good.
For example, in Libya right now, the Russians who supply all their arms have cut off sales to Libya. Right. So if that nation's military wants to take over, such as in Egypt when the president steps down, if they want to be able to reload their weapons, they have to be able to buy from the U.S. And so they better, again, I would assume, the implicit agreement is they're going to do things that are going to further the U.S. national interest.